Dispute about family. The house had collapsed, and a parasitic lifestyle could no longer be cultivated there. Adam had happily settled himself at the place of a very charming, extremely kind Bohemian sylph, who scattered around herself an equally charming chaos, just as Adam had managed to do in an uncharming way. This came simply from the fact that the things sprawling higgledy-piggledy around the girl's house seemed to have been painted there, and they were entirely more beautiful, more elegant, smelled better, and their jumbled placement in the apartment did not diminish their internal splendour. What ugliness can there be in a young woman's colourful, fluttering dresses, wispy stockings, underwear, belts, bags and hairbands? And books, when they're not covered in a thick layer of mould and full of moisture stains, may make for exquisite decor, even if they're dusty, and especially if they're all thick, heavy, hardcover, large-format works about art history, famous painters, and monumental architecture. And if their pages are quality, shiny gloss paper, and they still have the dust jacket, or if it's multiple volumes in a case. Vanda even said that she liked unwashed windows. There's a unique feeling in them. Soliswaf was once itching to clean them because, unlike Vanda, he liked a certain pedantic order, with things set by size into ziggurats, but she vetoed him. "My windows," she said, "must be just as they are, covered in a thick layer of street dust so that the rain can carve into it all kinds of different patterns. Leave them alone." Pots of ancient cacti stood in a line on the windowsill, but for some reason they did not seem at all doddery. They were like a fashionable installation. The furnishings of this bright, happy nest had been painted colourfully and carelessly so. The ancient dining table, once of dark wood and now full of engravings, was magenta on the top, one leg was green, one blue, one red, and one grey. In just the same way, the spindle-back chairs and ramshackle cabinet doors were mottled as whimsically, but not at all haphazardly, as an art project with a mixed pattern of spots, speckles, and stripes. The brightest bit of Adam Mickiewicz's life had just begun, and it started as was normal for him, with the complete disappearance of the two lovers from the horizon. When Adam was no longer anywhere to be seen, when no one knew where he was or what he was doing, everyone could breathe easier. He'd found a girl. He'd tried mightily but fruitlessly the whole time the house was full of chicks and everyone was living it up on his dime. Once, he even bought a guitar, a new one, from the shop, for a girl interested in music, simply to entice her into a date. The guitar cost a month's expenses, but Adam didn't care. And the girl still didn't come. Totally depressing. It isn't easy to live a single man's life when there are three newly smitten couples in the other rooms. Adam wandered around downcast for quite some time. He did buy himself some paisley scarves and wore his beret boldly askew, like the biggest Montmartre dandy, but for some reason he was no longer such a hit with women. It's entirely possible that people knew how he'd already mistreated two other girls. It's not as though the public actually cares, but it likes gossip. Even friends shook their heads and said, in low voices, that Adam really didn't do right by those two. Soliswaf, on the other hand, found his doe-eyed, frizzy-haired girl on a tram. Of course, he'd also ridden that tram route for weeks before he dared to speak to her. Teofil wrapped himself around his black-eyed beauty a half-head taller than him, and they made their nest in the attic, of all places. Their desire to live together was so great that he took it on himself to make this shit depot livable. All it took was some wood and a bit of will. They had to chuck the shit, of course. Thus disappeared the last of the Mickiewicz's silver spoons and century-old porcelain dishes. They certainly didn't bother to sort through it all. But now everything was so great. The house was the past, Vanda the future, and the miracle of all miracles, once the commune had split up and its members were out of each other's hair and into new digs, the connection, indeed, the brotherhood between them, again restored itself. But there was an exception. Teofil seemed to his comrades to have permanently disappeared. He and his new partner moved into a heated basement advertised as a house with a garden, and there they bravely faced the winter. It's possible that renting the garden house was a woman's cunning plan, because it didn't stay warm for a moment, even though there was an oven inside. Teofil spent the whole day heating this oven, because his partner demanded that their home be warm. Heavens, it was 30 centigrade in there. Teofil couldn't get a moment out of the house, But then their families took pity and organised a life for them. Their wedding was festive, proper and Catholic, and they were given a mountain of rare gold-rimmed dinner services and cutlery sets, as if the next day the newlyweds were going to start organising banquets for dozens of guests at once. All this enraged Adam to no end. The bourgeoisie were invading his people's heads. He turned his back on Théophile completely, showing a side of his character no one had yet seen, a side of grudges and vindictiveness. It was as much as maybe 5 years before they began to say hello to each other again, but their once brotherly connection never returned. For some reason, everyone always forgave Adam for his shenanigans, for disappearing into the wind with girlfriends, when he didn't answer calls or letters or let anyone find him for months. Of course, Adam never entered a bourgeois marriage. It isn't possible to sink so low. And in his words at least, he advocated a love worthy of a new era, free of possessiveness, because a person's body can't belong to another. Adam thought that the family was essentially a feature of social prestige. That's how he phrased it. He had a fossilized, cliché view of the family, the way that boys make up imaginary worlds free of everything stupid and boring, except in this case it was the opposite. Under the concept of family, Adam grouped everything bad and excluded everything good. For him, family is a respectably hard-working and successful husband, a good-looking wife, and little children. The wife's task is to hold on to her looks and to extend them into the area around her, turning even that into something beautiful and cosy. Let the children be good and study well, as they must unquestionably go to university. Because education is success, and success, in turn, is what we all hope for in life. All those who are not good, and for whom things do not go well, are failed as individuals and carry the designation vagrant. This word refers to a person without a fixed occupation or place of residence, who lives on odd jobs, abuses alcohol, lacks education, and whose use of language is banal and vulgar. So said Adam to Théophile's face. As far as he was concerned, the family as such is as repulsive as it is absurd, and it degrades a person's worth, both for themselves and in society. In general, where do you see a man and a woman together? He asked, cynically. Most often on the signs in public bathrooms, I think. Yeah, it's demagoguery, but generally it's strident demagoguery that works to promote ideas most effectively. Adam gave the impression that he considered the family ideal to be the good old Polish farm model, in which several generations grow together comfortably and in such a way that everybody helps everybody. The young study the wisdom of the old, and the old, for their part, aren't left on their own. There is no lonely old woman living in a derelict hovel in the woods, and there is no kid who checks in on her once or twice a year to ease his conscience. Maybe he carries some wood in for her. He's brought a pretty oilcloth tablecloth with a flower pattern, and a coffee pot with a new percolator, and he puts these status symbols bashfully onto the table. However little help he is, the solitary old woman overflows with gratitude. Goodness gracious me, you bring so much, and all this work you've done. I'd have stacked that wood for weeks. And she jams her little pension into the departing child's pocket. Take it, for the trip back, she says, and she watches him forlornly from the window as he goes. Thus the idea is a certain rurality. Cabbages grow on the farm and don't come from the store, and the logs smouldering beneath the stove are those that father brought directly from the forest. This seemed a nice thought to a boy whose own parents had been effete urbanites for devil knows how many generations, and none of them could actually do a single bit of serious work. Or then, the ideal is an ultra-bourgeois idea of one's own house, and not just some house, but a building with several floors, wings, oriel windows, owl holes, and nooks and crannies that would fit many kinds of deviants. Again, this is a relic of feudal life. These houses traditionally came with deranged family members in attic chambers and teemed with servants philandering both among themselves and with the lords. All the while, a sharp, inquisitive, aristocratic spinster weaves socks in an armchair and sees everything meant for the shadows, etc., etc. The classic backdrop for a murder play. Sir Lisfaf's contribution to the family debate was a communiste bidon. He thought that a certain kind of young man could freeload at the house of every nuclear family, a young man who doesn't necessarily have to be a leftist, but simply strange. A performance artist who strips naked in the garden and jumps over the fire, some moderate homo who's had a fight with his wife, or an anarchist with a bomb who needs a place to hide for a couple of days and then sees, it's quite nice, I won't leave at all. The custom of finding a home by moving in somewhere and then simply not leaving is one of the most resourceful solutions anywhere. Though Zawisza did actually know what he was talking about, for whatever reason he himself couldn't stay anywhere for all that long. Such people are the free radicals who help to balance the father-mother tandem bicycle, which is ideologically weak but societally stable. Imagine something like this. There's a house and a young family with 2 children is living on the top floor. One kid lives with them up there and the other is downstairs in a corner room. The grandmother is still living on the bottom floor and she can go out in the garden without having to go up and down the stairs. He gestured passionately with his hands as he began this flight of fancy. Now, Solisvav waved, check this out. 2 young artistic anarchist junkies come along and build themselves a little annex with the money they've scraped together. The annex has 2 rooms. Over time, it takes over the function of the drinking room from the big room on the top floor. The young anarchist junkies get along well with the grandma, and now grandma can release her pent-up social energy on them instead of having to go bother the family's teenager. And also, a 25-year-old junkie artist certainly has a lot more to discuss with an old woman than a crabby teen. So, Nan and the junkie take quiet walks around the garden. Puberty, over in the corner room, clearly doesn't have anything against the partying young types anyway. Basically, changez un peu. It doesn't just have to be that the couple brings food home from the store, locks themselves inside, eats for 2, screws for 2, and then watches TV for 2. All the while the TV programme is about how to be 40. There's this inhospitable element smouldering beneath the coziness and domestic bliss of the nuclear family. For whatever reason, you can't just slip into one. Yeah, Adam said, seriously. Better a wildebeest in the bathroom shitting all over the place than a man with a moustache and a beer in front of a TV. Of course, different kinds of relationships arise around a person as if from nowhere. Friends, acquaintances, wives, and children are sired from somewhere without any determined work or effort. And if they're already there, then go be a man and see how you manage, because, subconsciously, everyone fears the dangers that lurk in really close relationships. Mental and physical abuse, attachment, and certainly any silly argument. Whatever nice construction one might build up in the mind, it's no bother for another person to come along and knock it down. And even dumber, Solisvav pondered on, is that, besides toiling away at work, the man's other role in this operation is to pass on its ideology to the children. For the wife, it's usually enough if she loves the kids and maintains a kind of Hestian idyll. It's a weak and mustachioed worldview, exactly like the man himself. In a nuclear family, it's hard to convincingly pass on anything other than lukewarm ancestor worship and a moderate meritocracy, since the whole idea only consists of those 2 things, which is a warning to young people who think we'll do it differently or our nuclear family will be wicked. Such philosophizing didn't prevent any of them from living their own lives completely incorrectly. Solisvav turned out to be the irrationally jealous kind, and he only ever recognized one true love in his entire life. He'd stumbled onto a girl who was externally gentle, but internally extremely ambitious. They clashed so intensely that after a long, complicated, mentally suffocating love affair, they had to split up all the same, and against Solisvav's wishes. It came out that although young Zawisza was radical, open-minded, and magnanimous on paper, he was, in his core, identical to, or even crazier, than the men found in thousands of romance novels. It was bad enough that his sweetheart was an immense talent and devilishly hard-working, and though she might throw hard drinking and heavy smoking into the mix, she'd still achieved more than Solisvav ever had, either at any time or throughout his entire life. This schoolgirl was constantly winning all kinds of international competitions, and she performed on stages around the world because music doesn't respect international borders and one's knack for it is relatively easily globalized. By contrast, only a handful of Polish youths had ever read any of Solisvav's poems. When the house was still in working order, one could hear her lively, high-heeled footsteps clattering before dawn, leading after them the horrible droning of her rolling suitcase as she dashed off again to the airport. Behind them they left a poor man with wounded pride, in whom bubbled love, shame, and vanity, which is an explosive mixture. To satisfy her moods, Suliswaf freely agreed to candlelit dinners and roses, and wanted more than anything to prove that he, Suliswaf, could achieve what no other man in the world could, if only he were given the time. What's more, the right woman would simply have believed in him, looked at him with her big eyes, and repeated only, "Suliswaf, you're the smartest man in all the land." Because, in fairness, the world is unjust. Poland, to say nothing of the rest of the globe, didn't care much about Suliswafic young geniuses, because a gift of whatever kind must first be packaged into a form comprehensible to the masses, and only then broadcast widely, preferably with the help of colourful video clips. Success usually begins from a happy coincidence, and then one thing simply leads to another. A TV star who'd already made a name for himself ended up with a copy of Suliswaf's poems. This guy had a sharp eye and saw the righteous fury in Suliswaf's work, the kind of freshness no 40-year-old can squeeze out of themselves with any formula, and he saw that this was worth owning, worth swindling out of the hands of those who don't know what kind of lucre they've got or how to sell it to people, but who gift it or toss it away, scattering their young spirits' fiery scraps about themselves. And so, one beautiful morning, a pretty, curly-haired woman knocked on the door of Suliswaf's next bunker and introduced herself as N's assistant. She offered Suliswaf the chance to help them develop the themes of a new video piece, and he'd have free rein, of course. No one would try and limit the flight of his creativity. And that was the first financially measurable success. The Polish boys had no idea that, actually, lots of people had taken notice of them and were even a bit worried about this striking group of Poland's young. Their activities were followed rather closely. When would things go over the acceptable limit? In what direction would that go? Who were they talking to? Etc., etc. Nothing so extraordinary is ever left unnoticed. One simply has to create the impression that it isn't particularly important, doesn't much interest anyone, and that nothing will come of it anyway. With a hopeful, creative period in front of him, Suliswaf looked around his rented room with disgust. It really was a horrible spot. There wasn't even a table to put his typewriter on. Suliswaf had tried to work cross-legged on the floor, but he ended up hunched over with his legs asleep. He couldn't go on like this much longer because, once a person discovers the rare talent of finding homes that come with free food, then these homes might well think to offer other conveniences, if only for a change of pace. He quickly weighed a couple of as-yet unused options, and then his thoughts landed on Pani Zofia without unnecessary strain. Boom! She would work. Pani Zofia was a keen, perceptive woman whom life had far from coddled. She raised her daughter alone, and from time to time a scruffy man with matted hair who lived with his mother in the forest came by. The man's hands didn't work very well, and the colloquial term for him wasn't vagrant, but the sophisticated and nice-sounding libertine. He managed to register himself in the hearts of a few women, and so occasionally got to come to the city to sleep in a warm room and use the toilet, which didn't bring along any costs, but was instead pure profit. There exists an abundant species of women who simply have to gather up the most hopeless fellows. They lend them money, wash their laundry, cut their hair, and get for all this the knowledge that someone in the world might still love them. Even if this love spends more time looking through their fridge and wallet, it may yet be more stable than some other kinds of tenderness. When such a churl is fed up with his otherwise crap life, he leaves his threadbare house in the country with its cold floors and gets on the bus to the big city, where a beautiful, depressive woman, hovering somewhere between 30 and 40, is waiting for him. This is an interesting time in a woman's life. For some, the road from youth and beauty to wrinkles, flab, and the feeling that everything has passed is straight and uniform. For others, it is strange and winding. Occasionally, one lucky woman might be happier in her 40s than one in her 20s. Many women starting their lives have no idea what their good qualities are or what their overall potential might be. These foxes are bright, charming, clever and wise, know what men need, don't make scenes, don't make demands, and understand perfectly well that however incomparable they may be now, it is all flying off into the wind with every passing moment. Sooner or later they will end up, definitively, alone. They've dreaded this from the start, And the only unfortunate thing is that these women don't realise that solitude is their inheritance, and that not even a whole field hospital's worth of men in need of tenderness can take that away from them. These women can put up with truly shameless men in order to fill their infinite emptiness. And these men have seen a bit of life too, and they have little to hope for beyond that this class of women never runs out, that there are enough of them that they don't tire out or give up, that they find the strength, patience and care in themselves to take a new burnout into their bosom. You must only be careful that you don't squeeze her completely dry, otherwise things may end bitterly. It had gone somewhat badly for one woman. She'd taken a mortgage on her house to give a man some money, and that ran out, so she sold off her things piecemeal to give the man some more money, and that ran out faster than a person can blow their nose. They were once together in a shop. The woman, of course, paid for the groceries, and the man asked, entirely innocently, "Could you possibly loan me 10,000? I'm just a bit strapped right now." Without a word, the woman went to the bank, took out the money she'd spent 16 years saving for her child, and gave it to the man, who happily went on his way, while she, who hadn't been able to make the instalments on her mortgage in ages, hanged herself. Fortunately, this didn't happen in Poland. Our people don't have that kind of collateral. Later, it came out that this man's mother had also mortgaged her house to give her son money, but she was much too old to despair. It's quite unclear what these men do with all this money. They wear the clothes bought for them in their youth, which they've got stored away in their mother's attics, and they don't seem to squander it. Maybe they have a bottle of Starker and an evening wine once in a while, but that's pennies. They also remember to bring a bouquet of flowers to their good women sometimes, which melts hearts that may have turned icy in the meantime. In general, talking about money all the time smacks of narrow-mindedness, a fact that the women understand. They see it from the man's back whenever the conversation goes the slightest bit south. That back hunches so reproachfully and under such an oppressive weight that, if she has even the slightest sense, the woman should comprehend that in her man's destitute situation, to accept help from anyone is already a pride-shattering burden. A good person doesn't salt that wound, but keeps tenderly quiet and never brings up money. In a word, Pani Zofia was without question the kind of gracious person who helps the needy. It wouldn't even occur to her to say no. And Solisvav was the kind of pleasant company who, though he did take food from the fridge, ruled out any intimacy, and this makes getting along infinitely simpler. He also didn't plan to stay for more than a month, let's say. And just like that, a little bus trip later, Solisvav was ambling down a nice outer city street lined with horse chestnuts, which were already half bare and had big heaps of brown leaves and plump, shining nuts beneath them. Solisvav bent down robotically and put a chestnut into his pocket for good luck. Pani Zofia lived in a roomy apartment on the bottom floor of a dark red wooden house. There were 3 rooms in total, and she enthusiastically presented Zavisha with the darkest, dampest, most in-the-corner one. She'd listened to his situation with a distant expression, and after that he barely had to ask. "For my part," she said meekly, "you might well do a bit of work here for a while. Tadek's away right now, so it's just me and the girl anyway. Bring your typewriter. What should I make for dinner?" And everything was set. For the next few weeks, a very relaxing, rhythmic clatter sounded from the room in the corner, pausing at times when Solisvav would stick his head out of the door. "Zofia!" he called. "What is it, sweetie?" she answered, appearing from somewhere with folds of freshly ironed laundry over her forearm. "You want to have a coffee? Put a pot on. My mind's all blocked up right now," Solisvav complained. He'd grown a fashionable beard, so it would be perfectly clear that this man works. Coffee drunk, Solisvav crawled into a hot bath because, when you're tired, soaking in warm water is the best way to knock your head clear. From the door, Zofia gave him her old brown bathrobe and felt pleasantly useful. The sweet smell of cake came from the kitchen. It was an apple cake of one of grandmother's homey recipes, and it had a thick egg and sour cream frosting on top that glowed gold through the oven window. She'd already picked up dark purple gabardine pants, a pink shirt with big clunky collar corners, and a checkered wool vest, and tossed them all into the laundry. "They smelled of tobacco, and they'll be dry by tomorrow anyway, and I might even be able to iron them," she apologised, when Solisvav asked for his clothes. When Zofia was looking for dirty clothes in her daughter's room, she discovered juice and a box of cookies hidden under the windowsill behind the curtain. The discovery soured her mood. Obviously, the girl was afraid that Solisfaf would eat her food at night when no one was watching. But this habit of keeping things only for yourself had come from Tadek, who'd once caused a real fight when he discovered that someone had eaten his bread out of the cupboard. When they went to the store, Zofia and Tadek even put the little baton on the conveyor between their things as if they were two complete strangers, and a bewildered cashier would then watch them shovel their separate items into a single bag. That's a weird pair, the salesgirl would think to herself, shaking her head. Zofia bought everything they needed, but 2 bottles of beer, a loaf of bread, and a pack of candies were things that Tadek both bought and ate himself. But it's not as if he didn't come to the table and eat with the others, even if he had to be asked. But of course, Zofia always asked him politely once the soup was already steaming on the table. "Tadek," she said, appearing cautiously at the door, "dinner is ready." "Oh, look how nice," he said, rubbing his hands and getting up from his desk. But sometimes it happened that the Pani had fixed up some dish he couldn't eat, whether it was too spicy, too salty, too watery, too thick, too much meat, too many vegetables, and then he would answer bitterly, "No, thanks for asking. I can't eat that. I'll have a sandwich later." Things were quite bad when Zofia, finally surly over this, made no extra invitation to her husband at all, but decided that the clatter of dishes and the smell of the food ought to be enough for anybody hungry. This artless behaviour culminated in hours of sulking and an entirely unhealthy home atmosphere. Ultimately, it was Zofia who had to ask for forgiveness. "I'm not going to come and eat your food uninvited," Tadek announced, offended, when the Pani was already in tears. It was never like this with Solisfaf. He liked her food, and he knew how to be grateful.